Good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm not really sure when you're watching this, but hello and welcome to the first part of your notes, Immigration and Urbanization, Chapter 15. In case you haven't noticed, I am currently trying to record using two different cameras, so I'm not sure which one's looking at you right now. It's probably kind of freaky, but I'm going to try to record both of these videos at the same time so that in case one doesn't work, I've got a backup. But let's go ahead and go through our notes, starting with slide 1, Immigration and Urbanization. Okay, as we go through here, you'll notice I'll be clicking on the slides on my computer, but if you're watching through this camera, then you'll just have to kind of follow along with your own slides. So hopefully you have those. Let's start talking about immigration. What I mean by that, this is going to be an overview, this first slide here, about what it is that we're going to talk about. This is going to be taking us through the next section of notes. This is sort of a preview of what we're going to talk about. So we're talking about 23 million immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe that came to the United States during this time period that we're talking about, 1880s through early 1900s. They came usually by steamboat, through steamship, through a 14-day journey. This is not just like, hey, let's go get on a plane, take a few hours to get to the United States. This was a 2-week journey, and they usually went through a process building like Ellis Island, Angel Island. Those are the things that we're going to talk about. Well, why did they come? Well, why does anybody come? To find better life for themselves. United States had a lot of jobs because we were industrializing, as well as those specific, the factories, things like that. They were also coming to avoid military service, to avoid religious persecution that they were experiencing in their country, as well as just to find a new opportunity for a new life. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to be talking about in this unit. Okay, so let's talk specifically about some of those factors of why they came. When people leave, there's something that's usually pushing them out, that's pushing them away from their country, kicking them out of their country, if you will. So those push factors are going to be things like poverty, if they're poor, and they are not having good economic situation in their home country, they're going to try to find a new one that's pushing them out. Poverty, not having a job, war. A lot of these countries were going through civil war, civil strife, military conflicts, and they were actually being required to serve in the military, sometimes for the rest of their life. Not just like, for 6 months, a couple of years, but for an extended period of time, they were required to serve in the military, no matter how old they were, and nothing like that. They had to do that. So that's the push factor. There are also many dictatorships and monarchies. We know dictator and monarchy; those are going to be government systems where one person is in charge, calling all the shots. Sort of like a tyrant type situation. So a lot of people are coming from those types of government situations and wanting to get away from that. And of course, as I mentioned a second ago, the religious oppression, that their particular religion was being persecuted, oppressed in some way in their home countries. And so they were trying to find, religious freedom somewhere else, specifically the United States. So we were pulling them in. As their old country was pushing them out, we were pulling them in, trying to get them into the United States. We had lots of land. We had lots of jobs because of industry. Land because the West was being settled at this time. We were a democratic country. Freedom. People get to make the choices. That is very intriguing for some of these countries that they're coming from, monarchies and dictatorships where they have no voice, they have no freedom. So a democracy is something that's going to be very appealing to them. As well as social advancement, that they have a chance, that they were poor. We talked about capitalism, free enterprise. One of the beautiful things about capitalism is that you can start with nothing. If you have a good idea and you work really hard, you can build up to being an Andrew Carnegie. So they're seeing, other immigrants like that making something of themselves, the gold rush, all that kind of stuff, and they knew that this could be their chance to advance socially and make a better life for themselves. So that social advancement, and of course the religious freedom that we mentioned, that they did not have in their home country. They're experiencing oppression, but in the United States, they did have that religious freedom. So that's what we call a push factor, something that's pushing them out, and then a pull factor, something that's bringing them in. They were being pushed out of their home country, being pulled into the United States. Okay, so as we talk about immigration, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Okay, this time period is referred to as the Great Migration because people were migrating at very high rates from, the different countries throughout Europe, etc. And we as a country, the United States, we didn't really have requirements in terms of requiring them to be a certain, a certain religion, a certain even economic, that there was no requirements for entry, that they, everybody's welcome in the United States. So this is going to lead to a great migration. People are going to take that up and want to come to the United States. A lot of other countries at this time actually had rules that prevented people from leaving. For a really long time, they actually would not be allowed to leave their country. And around this time period, not only did we not have any requirements keeping them out, but we're going to see those countries are going to let go of those requirements keeping them in. So there's not really going to be any reason for them not to come, because they used to be sort of held back and would not be allowed to leave. Now those countries are letting go of those rules, and immigrants can leave their country, and we have nothing stopping them from coming. So there's no reason not to come, especially in the face of all those pull factors. There's more reasons to come. So now there's going to be a lot of people coming. That's going to lead to what we refer to as urbanization. I'll talk about that. That's the building up of cities, those urban areas. Population growth is going to explode. And of course, industrialization with those new workers. Okay, so our next slide here that we're on now, if you're following along, is about the old and the new immigrants. There's two different types of people in the United States at this time. There was the old immigrants, those who had come prior to 1880, and as they'd come before then, they usually came from northern and western parts of Europe. That's like Germany and Ireland, England, right? Our forefathers and that kind of stuff. They came from those northern and western parts of Europe, and they got here before 1880. Your new immigrants are going to be the ones that we're talking about mostly now, that came after 1880, mostly from those south and eastern parts of Europe, especially those that had requirements that wouldn't allow them to leave previously. Now those requirements are gone, so we're going to see, starting in the 1880s, a whole new group of immigrants. Your typical immigrant is going to be male, young, and either Catholic or Jewish, because those were the people that were being the most persecuted religiously in their countries. And male and young, because those were the ones that really could afford to go first. A lot of the men would come first and find a job, figure out the country, find a place to live, and then send word home. And those who were able to travel, older people couldn't make that 2-week journey, couldn't go through the process of traveling. So they typically stayed. It was the young ones, the young men, that were typically traveling. And again, just to sort of re-emphasize this new immigrant from South and East Europe, by the 1890s, half of the immigrants that had come into our country were from this region of South and Eastern Europe. Places like Italy, Greece, they were Polish, the Slavs, the Slovaks, the Russians, the Armenians. These were the people that were coming in, this sort of second wave of immigration, these new immigrants. Okay, so these new immigrants, I mentioned that it took them about 8 to 14 days, so about 2 weeks, certainly more than a week, to travel here. The poorer ones who could afford to come at all, they would go into the steerage. The steerage part of the ship It's going to be sort of your most basic, your cheapest accommodations. It's going to be really kind of filthy, smelly, crowded, but this is how the poor came. If they could afford to come at all, they came on steerage. As they got to the country, we're talking especially these Europeans, they came across the Atlantic, right? Because that's the ocean that's between Europe and North America. Hopefully you knew that already. So as they came across the Atlantic, they got to New York City. That's where all of these sort of immigrant ships docked, if you will, at Ellis Island. And so at Ellis Island is where they would be processed. They'd sort of be tagged, marked by language, medical inspections. 1 out of every 5, or 20%, were actually quarantined, set aside, and said, you are not healthy enough to enter our country. Maybe, it could just be that they had a cold and they needed to recover. Although it's typically more than a cold if you were being quarantined, but sometimes it was just a temporary situation until they could get better, or until another doctor, came and checked them. But they were set aside and marked for some sort of health precaution. And if it was significant enough, they would actually be sent back. So they went through Ellis Island, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's kind of the idea here, is as they came in, they were sort of tagged or marked, quarantined, set aside. That's what quarantine means. And some were actually sent back. So as they entered America, you see on this slide here called Entering America, they would go through the registry hall. Immigrants would line up by language. So, all the people who spoke Greek would be in this area lined up. All the people who spoke Italian would be in this area lined up. So they would sort of segregate them, and that way they would wait several hours to go through this inspection process. And that was not even if they were quarantined or marked or set aside or anything. That was just regular person going through the line. Took them 2 to 3 hours to do that. And the inspector would question them for their skills, for their beliefs, just kind of getting an overall profile of who they were and what they were doing in the country, those kinds of things. Okay, so that's just an image there under Entering America of what Ellis Island was like. Okay, after they left Ellis Island, most immigrants settled in nearby cities. Again, they came out of Ellis Island, was based in New York, so a lot of them stayed right there in New York. Some went to Chicago, Detroit, other major cities at the time, but a lot of them just stayed right there in New York City. We're going to see New York City is going to have a boom that we're going to talk about when we get to the urbanization section of your notes. But they settled in nearby cities, and they lived in these close-knit ethnic neighborhoods called enclaves. This is where even modern day you go to a place like New York City and they'll talk about Little Italy, because that's where all the Italians, when they came over, they passed through Ellis Island, and they all sort of grouped themselves together, and in order to sort of recreate life as it was in their native land, so that they're all together, they're all eating the same foods, they're all speaking the same language, and going to the same church, so that life is very similar to what it was like in Italy, only without, the oppression and the economic hardships and those kinds of things. So they have this freedom, but they also still have each other and still have the people that speak their native language and look and think like them. And it actually helped them adjust to American life a lot easier. Those who settled in these groups with sort of like-minded people and the same ethnicity actually adjusted to American life a lot better, because they had a built-in support system right there in their neighborhood, people who spoke their language and can help them out. They had this comfort level with them. So that's what it was like for those leaving Ellis Island. We've mostly talked about the European immigrants, but there's also a big group of people who came from Asia. They came, of course, on the West Coast, crossing the Pacific. Hopefully you know that they crossed the Pacific to get from Asia to the United States, and the West Coast being like California area. Okay, we know the gold rush was going on at this time. We know the railroad was being built at this time. So this is where a lot of the Chinese immigrants came specifically to work in those places. As they came over through the West Coast, they landed at Angel Island. That was like the West Coast version of Ellis Island that we just talked about. But instead of being held for just a few hours, they were actually held for months. Several months it took them to process through these Asian immigrants. And you're going to see as just sort of a pause here on the push and the pull, going back to those vocabulary words. One of the reasons they were being pushed so strongly out of China is that China at this time was experiencing extreme poverty, unemployment, a population just explosion that had left them without many resources because they were fighting over jobs, they were fighting over food, famine, civil war, all these things were happening in China at the time, pushing them out. And meanwhile, the pull factors of the railroad and the gold rush that I just mentioned, those pull factors were luring them in. However, they really didn't anticipate that in the United States at this time, there was this growing rise of what's called nativism. This is the idea of, this is my land. This is where I live. This is, sort of America. And we don't like those who were not born in America. And you see this attitude still very heavily prevalent even today. But this time period, it was definitely rising, and sort of ironically from those old immigrants who they themselves were immigrants, but maybe not they themselves, but maybe a couple generations ago. So they were born in the United States, even though their grandparents immigrated here and went through the same process. They weren't. They were born in the United States. And so to see all these immigrants, all these people coming in that were not from the United States, they had this extreme dislike for them, a strong prejudice. Okay, this is sort of the idea of nativism, of we were born here and we're naturally sort of better than you because of that. They had a very strong fear, was their motivation for this, like a very strong fear, because they thought that their culture, especially if we talked about the religion, we talked about the Jewish people coming and the Catholic people coming, these Asians with their different religion, it was definitely a cultural, religious fear, because at the time, the United States was Protestant. And as Protestant is sort of the opposite of Catholicism. So as these Catholics, ironically, were trying to flee the persecution from their home country, and they got here, yes, there's religious freedom, but a lot of the Protestants were afraid that if a lot of Catholics came in, a lot of Jewish people came in, then their voice in the government would start favoring some of these other religious groups. And so they were motivated by this fear. So even though there's religious freedom here, the Protestants were sort of afraid to let go of the control. And so they were very motivated to try to prevent them from coming here. And it actually ended up sort of turning violent in some cases. And eventually the government is going to step in, and they're going to start by doing things like taxing them, limiting them. They're going to start passing immigration laws. And we see here in 1882 that they actually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that formally ended immigration from those Chinese people coming over here. It was meant to only last 10 years. That was the original 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, forbidding them from sort of coming in, and not just their culture, but of course the job competition, and they were afraid of them taking their jobs. One of the biggest pushes behind these kinds of laws, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, were actually from the union movement, because they were afraid that these immigrants would come in. They'll take any job. They were, just happy to find a job, as opposed to where they were coming from and the economic oppression they were experiencing. So they were willing to work very, very cheaply, kind of going against what the labor union was fighting for with the higher wages and the shorter work days and the safer environments. And a lot of these immigrants actually ended up being strike breakers, or scabs, that we learned about last week in class. And they were willing to work when others were on strike, when the union members were on strike. So a lot of the Native people, especially the union members, really did not like that they were undermining the efforts that they had been making on the labor front. So this Chinese Exclusion Act, to talk about that for a second, it was originally intended for 10 years, but every 10 years they ended up renewing it up until they ended up actually making it permanent at one point, and then it wasn't repealed until 1943. So from 1882 to 1943, the United States actually had laws specifically against Chinese people immigrating to our country, because they were that genuinely afraid of them coming in, taking our jobs, their religious, their cultural differences, the language difference, that they just really did not have very strong, oftentimes even violent reaction against the Asians coming in. Okay, and just sort of one last slide I want to show you here is this political cartoon. So I want you to sort of take a second and look over that. I want you to look at the image. It's just kind of ironic what you see here on this screen is all these native, these are sort of the nativism, the native people telling the immigrant, no, we don't want you, get back, get out. And yet in their shadow, we see an image of them when they were immigrants. We see that they traveled the same weary journey, that they were in just as desperate shape as this immigrant is, and that at one point they needed the refuge of the United States, and that in the United States, I mean, you see them, they're wealthy, they're prosperous, they're wearing nice clothes and nice hats, and you can kind of tell that they've got themselves figured out. And this immigrant is just asking for that same kind of chance that they got. If you look at their sort of pathetic pictures of them when they first came over here, whether that was in reference to their grandparents come over here, but they're kind, they're people. If you look at these different sort of ethnicities here, they came in the same search as this Chinese immigrant is coming to try to find a new life in America. So that's the first section. You made it. It's only 22 minutes and however long I continue to talk. So the video wasn't too bad. You will have 2 more videos to watch after this. You can decide whether you want to watch it right now, continue watching. If you want to pause, work on your project, whatever the case may be, just make sure that you are getting these notes filled in your handout, because I will be collecting those on test day. So if you need to go back and re-watch this, if you need to just go through the slides again, this video is here for you to watch, to do what you want with, and hopefully to learn this information. If you have any questions about any of the things that I talked about on here that you're just like, what did you mean by that? I really had no idea when you were talking about that, what that meant. That's what class time is for. I'm available this week during class time. So make sure that you take that time to ask those questions. Okay, this is it for now. I hope you enjoyed my aquarium backdrop here in the girls' playroom at my house. And I will see you next time. So goodbye. Power button is here.